I wish this picture had been taken in the Firth of Forth, but it hasn't. It could maybe represent a dream for the future when we might have some sperm whale groups, which is what is actually pictured here, being tailed by a research vessel up the Forth. But this was taken actually in one of the other field sites that I work at in the Eastern Caribbean off the island of Dominica, where there is a healthy population of sperm whales. So Ken asked me to come talk, and he sort of wanted me to try and put a sort of Firth of Forth focus on some of the research that I do, and I have to be completely upfront that I do research in a variety of places, and my involvement on the east coast of Scotland has largely been through Marine Scotland, who have been deploying a system of acoustic arrays, listening devices, essentially, from all the way up the east coast, from north of Aberdeen to actually south of the Firth of Forth. And I've had a number of students analysing those data to try and understand what we can get out about how specifically bottlenose dolphins actually are using this part of the world, because they are one of the species that's attracted quite a lot of legislation, and governments tend to follow legislation. And so there's been quite a lot of investment in protecting this population. With some success, as we'll go on to talk about here. So in my talk, I thought, well, I don't have a lot of direct research to talk about in terms of the Firth of Forth, but I could give a kind of summary of some of the things we know about some of the species that are being seen on a fairly regular basis, and I'll intersperse that with a little bit of what I do as well. Okay, so I'm based at here in the Badlands of St Andrews. My office is in the University of St Andrews, where I'm speaking to you from tonight. And while in St Andrews, there are two organisations that I'm part of. One is the Sea Mammal Research Unit, and the other is called the Centre for Social Learning and Cognitive Evolution. And I hope it'll become apparent during the talk why I have these two organizations on my title slide. Right, advance. Okay, so a lot of what I do is studying actually the societies of various cetacean species, and four of the best studied ones are depicted here. The humpback whales, the killer whales on the top right, sperm whales bottom left, and bottlenose dolphins bottom, sperm whales bottom right, and bottlenose dolphins bottom left. And next to each image of the animal itself is a visualization of their social structures, where each dot in these graphics represents an individual, and the sort of gray lines or thick and dark lines between them represents the strength of social bonds between those individuals. So you know, you can imagine if one were to follow you around and then look at how much time you spent in the vicinity of other individuals, and then draw lines between yourself and other individuals based on how frequently that happened, this is the kind of picture that would develop. It's called a social network. And then these four species, all of which have been seen in the Firth of Forth in recent years, you'll see that there's this real diversity in how their social structures have evolved. So humpback whales are sort of very gregarious. They have this very unstructured network, whereas killer whales are very highly structured, as are sperm whales, into long-term social units. And bottlenose dolphins kind of fit somewhere between the two. They're kind of gregarious, but they do have divisions in their communities. And so I've been really fascinated throughout my career in kind of understanding why these different species have the different shapes in their communities that they seem to have, these different distributions of patterns of interaction with other individuals. And one of the reasons that I'm really interested in that is because through these connections, we've come to understand whales and dolphins of different species share information with each other. We've got a growing appreciation over the last sort of 2 decades of just how much of the behavior of these animals is actually determined not by what they inherit through their genes, but what they learn from each other. Okay, in a similar way that humans learn things from each other. In fact, that's sort of really defining characteristic of humans. We learn so much from each other, from our what is called our cultural inheritance, that it's almost easy to forget that we even had genes at all. If you look around you, from your own clothes to the house that you're in to the technology that you're seeing this talk on, none of that is encoded in our DNA. It's all learnt or acquired over multiple generations of innovation and spreading of ideas. And actually, we think, by we, I mean my colleague Hal Whitehead and myself, think that in some species of whale and dolphin, this process, this learning process, is absolutely central to how for them to develop into sort of fully functioning members of a cetacean community, such as the ones that I presented in the previous slide. That without that knowledge of where to go, when to go there, and what to do, what to feed on when you're there, then these animals are somewhat lost, and it sort of speaks to their intense sociality as creatures. And I think it also speaks to a little bit to why we might be seeing some species of whale and dolphin returning to the Firth of Forth now that the ecological conditions and the prevailing attitude to hunting these animals have changed somewhat. It's a slow and developing process by which some animals explore, and then that knowledge or that information may transmit through areas of through different parts of the community or the social networks in which those animals are embedded. In some cases, it's because these populations are actually growing again after whaling has ceased. In some cases, we have good evidence for that. In others, we have very little evidence either way, because it turns out to be very difficult to count these animals accurately. But as we'll see, and as I think you're going to hear from my colleague Monica Arso-Seville in the new year, about her work on the bottlenose dolphin population, there's been some success as well in that population growing and expanding in its range over the last 10 to 15 years. So there's reason to hope, and there's reason to think about why some of these animals are beginning to be seen again. But it's also reason to be patient, because they aren't, they're animals that are making decisions about where to go all the time, and their decisions are going to be informed by what they've learned during their lifetime. So sometimes it takes, it seems to be taking some populations. We've very good evidence of this from populations of southern right whales in the southern hemisphere, for example, that are not recolonizing areas where they were previously abundant, because the knowledge of those particular migration routes has been lost to the population. And so these dynamics may also be occurring in some of these species, and that it might take a longer time than you might expect simply by straight up diffusion of these animals exploring, which case they should rapidly rediscover this habitat. But it may well be that it takes some time to build up the knowledge in the broader population that this habitat is now available again. So we have an enormous diversity of whales and dolphins in the world, ranging in size and ecology, but there are representatives of nearly all the major groups that you can see in the Firth of Forth. And just to give you some of the sort of latest information, again, this is courtesy of my colleague Monica, who's been leading a field effort this summer doing surveys up and down the East Coast. And from this, you can see the tracks, and you can also see in red the sightings of bottlenose dolphins going, really quite far up to the into the Firth, but concentrating really quite close to the coast, either on the north or the south side. And also the occasional minke whale popping up, as well as harbour porpoises. So if you were to take a boat out onto the Forth today, these are some of the creatures that you might see. Okay. To put this into a larger regional context, one of the reasons that animals end up, I think, coming down the east coast of Scotland. Well, we can think about essentially two types of cetaceans. Ones which are more or less resident, all right? So smaller ones like harbour porpoises and bottlenose dolphins that are sort of very much attached to a particular piece of coastal ecology. They are marine species, but often it is the coast that provides the environmental structure or the environmental dynamics or the ecological diversity that they need in order to make their living, right? So vast areas of the deep ocean are actually ecological deserts. There's not a lot going on, and it's when you get the interactions between tides and onshore productivity and environmental structure that coasts provide that often generates the ecological opportunities for some of these smaller cetaceans. And then you have the larger ocean-going ones who are totally comfortable in the deep ocean, your humpbacks and your sperm whales, for example. And we know that there are very prosperous feeding grounds on the coast of Norway for killer whales, for sperm whales, for humpback whales. And in the summer months, these waters are teeming with herring, and they support large numbers of humpback whales, killer whales, and even sperm whales. All the way up here, there are lots of knowledge about there being high abundance of these animals. And at least in the case of sperm whales and killer whales and humpback whales, we know that they also move large distances, right? So we know that killer whales from the Shetlands have been seen in the Faroes and in Iceland on occasion. We know that sperm whales from the north of Norway have been seen off the Azores, and they make their way down along these large ranges. And humpbacks from the north of Norway actually go down to Cape Verde Islands to breed. So every year there are animals kind of passing through the Faroes Channel here. And sometimes they will make mistakes, and they'll end up turning left when they meant to go straight on, and end up sort of getting down into the North Sea and encountering the east coast of Scotland and ending up in places like the Firth of Forth. So a lot of the sort of information I'm going to present just now on which species are present and what kind of abundances we might be looking at is drawn from this really recent report published by some colleagues of mine, led by Emily Haig, on our current baseline knowledge of marine mammals in the North Sea and the adjacent Atlantic areas of Scottish waters. And this report was prepared and published this year in the context of ongoing development plans for offshore renewable work. And in that report, you'll find a map. This is available online. You can go and look it up. You'll find a map sort of showing here in the various shaded regions the actual or proposed marine protected areas and special areas of conservation that have been either proposed if they are in sort of hatched fill or actually in effect if they are solidly filled, that have been generated with respect to protecting marine mammals. Okay, and you'll notice there's not a lot going on in the Forth. There's a grey seal special area of conservation just to the south, and one very specific location on the Isle of May where there's a breeding colony. And then there are areas associated with harbour seals in the mouth of the Tay here, but not a lot else. Whereas further north, there are special areas of conservation for the bottlenose dolphins, and on the west coast, there are actual and proposed special areas of conservation for a variety of species, minke whales and harbour porpoises and Risso's dolphins. And this is in the context of these red boxes here, which are actually draft areas that are proposed as potential option sites for marine renewable development, largely offshore wind farms. So we could definitely be doing better in terms of protection in the Forth, but that's maybe a longer term project as well. So there's been some humpbacks recently. I have some students in my group in St Andrews who so one of the things I'm particularly interested in, as well as social structure, is behavior, and particularly vocal behavior. So humpback whales are known for their songs, which I hope you'll be able to hear playing in the background now as I'm trying to share my audio. Ooh. So these kind of complex songs that they make are actually one of the things that they do. We know they learn from each other. Humpback songs are always changing, and entire populations are kind of singing what is the latest song together, and then they move on as new fashions come into play. And using that information, we can trace connections from the humpbacks that migrate past the north of Scotland and occasionally find their way into the Firth of Forth, to breeding grounds on the Cape Verde Islands, and sometimes way over in the Caribbean. So these whales are true sort of ocean nomads, and you might see a whale in the Firth of Forth in several months' time. It could be in equatorial waters, it could be in the Cape Verdes, or it could be in the Caribbean. So they really do provide a connection from here to all over the North Atlantic. Our current best estimate, and it's an estimate, and even though it's our best estimate, it's not a very good one, because it's really hard to count these animals to go out and survey a particular area of ocean. But our best estimates is that there may be around 35,000 of these animals in the North Atlantic. So they are a species that is in, doing reasonably well in terms of their numbers. And of course, perhaps one of the reasons that you're all here is because we've begun to see these on a semi-regular basis in the Firth of Forth. The last time we know of that one swam up the Tay in the 1800s, it came to an unfortunate end, and so I'm looking forward to the next time one comes up the Tay to see if it gets a different reception this time. But it certainly really generates a lot of excitement to see these creatures in the Firth of Forth. Okay, the other baleen whale that we see regularly here is the minke. It's not as known for its sort of prolific songs as the humpback, but it does have its own vocal repertoire. It's not what you'd call a chart topper, but I'll just try and play this for you, and you can see if you can pick it up. Sounds almost like a heartbeat. But again, these are a sort of rudimentary form of song, and by analyzing them carefully, we can pick up variations that seem to be associated with different populations. And I had a student working on these vocalizations a couple of years ago who seemed to show that there was a connection again between some of the minkies that were recorded in Scottish waters, and judging by the similarity of their song, there's some connection with minkies that are seen and recorded off the east coast of the United States. So again, there may be these migratory links between animals that we see in the Firth of Forth and animals that are found way further afield. Okay. And again, the minke was not a massive target of whaling. It was the smaller one it was one of the smallest of the baleen whales. So there are thought to be around 24,000 left in the North Atlantic, but they are still actually actively hunted in places. So in Norway and Iceland, there are ongoing whaling operations targeting minke whales. Okay, this is the animal that Monica is going to talk to you about, the bottlenose dolphins. We have our own Eastern Scotland population of bottlenose dolphins. And that population is expanding both in numbers and in range. So when scientists first started studying it, it was largely confined to the Moray Firth and the waters around that area. But in recent years, we've seen a very clear expansion, an increase in numbers, and an increase in the occupancy of waters south of that core area, increasing numbers of sightings in the Tay and in the Forth. These guys, I warn you, if you're sensitive to high pitches, this might be a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm just going to play you some of the whistles that you might hear if you were to put a listening device around these animals. So an interesting fact about these whistles is that each bottlenose dolphin appears to develop its own specific form of whistle, which is called a signature whistle, and the sort of pitch and modulation or changes in pitch that these whistles have appeared to be unique to individuals. So in the context of what I was saying earlier about being involved in listening to in Marine Scotland's research, listening to the recordings from these devices that have been placed up and down the east coast here, we're working to see if we can actually track individual dolphins by their signature whistles as they move up and down the coast, and try and understand how many animals we might be hearing at these different spots, and comparing that with the data that Monica's been collected from visual surveys. And so far they seem to match quite well, but it's very much ongoing work. But it's kind of neat to think that by the animals making their individually distinctive calls, we can actually tell who's in the area by listening rather than actually going out and seeing them. Oh, let's do that again. And yeah, there is evidence that they are increasingly beginning to use the Firth of Forth. They've been using the Tay quite extensively, and you know, one of the best places to go and see them is on in Tayport. If you go onto the harbour wall there on a high tide, you can often see them. They appear to love chasing salmon up against the pilings there, so it's a good place to go see them. But you can often see them also along the south coast of Fife here. I've done so myself when I've gone out from Anstruther, so that's a real treat. And we sometimes get them in St Andrews here. So some of you might have remembered the last time this species was seen in the Firth of Forth. It was actually quite a sad event. There was a stranding of pilot whales between Anstruther and Pittenweem, and several students and members of the SMRU team were involved in trying to pull the animals off the beach, and also doing necropsies and trying to learn what we could about the animals when they were if they had passed away. Some of the animals were refloated and did appear to return to sea. And it's an interesting feature of pilot whales all around the world. This is very much a global species. There are a lot of them around the world. Is that they do this kind of strange mass stranding behavior, where a whole group will end up on the beach rather than just one sick animal. And again, in our book, which I obviously encourage you to go out and buy, there is we put forward the suggestion that this feature might actually also be related to the fact that these animals are so dependent on knowledge from others, so much so that for a pilot whale, most of the time the imperative to stick with your group to find out, to follow the elder animals in your group, the ones that have the most experience and therefore knowledge, is so important on the whole, that they're unable to distinguish when that's a good idea and a bad idea, and so they follow them up onto the beach. And this is one potential explanation for why these kind of mass stranding events might occur. They're a very vocal species, so here's what they sound like, and they're really fun. They seem to like chorusing like this, where there are multiple animals making the same sound at the same time. I could go on forever, but you know, let's keep it. And these animals, they are hunted a little bit in the Faroe Islands, but not in any great numbers, and they're still estimated to be on the order of 500,000 of them in the North Atlantic. So, but they are primarily a deep water species, so it's quite rare for them to make it into the Firth of Forth. And when they've done so, as this stranding seems to indicate, it might actually be a mistake, an animal that has led its pod astray, as it were. We've also seen these guys, a rare treat in the Firth of Forth, but they have been sighted. So killer whales, notoriously known for being the only marine mammal that regularly preys on other marine mammals. Again, a highly vocal species. So let's hear what they sound like. So these calls that you're hearing are called discrete calls. You know, not because they're indiscreet, but because they are very distinctively separate from each other. So you could hear that call type was very different from the one you heard previously. And one feature of this is these calls is that instead of having individually distinctive ones like the bottlenose dolphins, then these animals have group-specific calls. So those calls you would have heard just then will be specific to a particular matriline or group of matrilines, a group of social units, which we term a vocal clan. As I said, these whales specialize in particular dietary sources. Some of them do eat fish, but many of them also eat marine mammals. There's estimated that there may be as many as 15,000 in the North Atlantic as a whole, but I have colleagues who have studied them using photographic identification around the Shetland Islands, and the population there is quite small, so probably on the order of tens of animals, and it's almost certainly that population or members of that population that sometimes make their way down. And you can see all kinds of amazing footage from people who've spent time studying them in the Shetlands, where they go in and chase seals into around the rocks on the shore. And this seems to be what they are doing when they do make it down to the Firth of Forth. And there are potentially rich pickings there off the Isle of May. So it remains to be seen as to whether, you know, this appearance of killer whales off the Isle of May in 2015 actually leads to a growth of knowledge in that population about the availability of prey off the Isle of May, where there's a seal breeding colony. I expect many of us would be excited if that were the case, although the seals themselves would probably not be as excited. Okay, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about these guys who have also been seen on rare occasions in the Firth of Forth. And let me say straight up that, you know, the Firth is not the natural habitat of sperm whales. They're very much a deep water species. So when they have made their way into the Firth of Forth, it's likely a mistake, and one hopes that when they go out again, they head north and go back into the deeper waters north of Scotland, because there have been a number of occasions where that's not happened, and animals have gone further south, deeper into the kind of trap of the North Sea, if you like, and by the time they get down to the shallow waters at the southern end of the North Sea, there's a lot of industrial activity, there's a lot of shipping, there's a lot of very confusing things for sperm whales there, and when they get down that far, there's a pretty decent chance that they're going to end up on a beach either off Norfolk or Holland or Denmark, stranded, because the North Sea is not really their natural habitat. But I'm going to talk about them for a while, because I've spent a lot of my time studying these animals. They're still really successful. These animals were hunted vigorously all through the Yankee whaling period and in industrial times, right through to you know, in the 1980s there was still a fishery off Peru, and they're still being taken in the Azores in a kind of artisanal fishery then during the 1980s as well. But despite that, they're still thought to be on the order of 30,000 of them in the North Atlantic. So it's not surprising that every now and then one sort of goes a bit astray and finds its way into the Forth. And as I said, this is an animal that I spent a lot of time studying. So this is me going out looking for sperm whales, actually off the coast of Chile in South America. So again, this is a global species, and we spend a lot of time taking photographs of their tails like this, because we can use those photographs to tell individual animals apart, and that's how we learn to draw the kind of images I showed you earlier about their social structures. The reason that the Firth of Forth is not their natural habitat is because their food is primarily deep sea squid, like this one that we recovered next to a group of sperm whales in Dominica. You can see the nice round hole in the mantle of the squid that's been made by the tooth of the sperm whale. And you get some idea of the kind of size of the prey that they might be targeting. They have to eat an awful lot of these to maintain their bulk, and these squid live at hundreds of meters of depth. So 600, 800, 1,000 meters are regular foraging dive depths for sperm whales. So they're deep water animals, which is why the Firth of Forth is not their natural habitat, right? Because you can't get those depths of water in the Firth of Forth. But they do show up here occasionally, and you know, not just in singletons, but here's a group of them that have made their way into the Firth of Forth. Not very far in, to be fair. It was just around the Isle of May, but they were in the mouth there. It wouldn't really be a happy place for them if they were to go further into the Firth of Forth like this, because, as I say, they're really not shallow water animals. Their home is the deep sea. But as I indicated before, they live in these social units, very strongly bonded to each other, and it turns out that these are matrilineal family units. So they're based around the maternal line, their grandmother, their daughter, and their granddaughters. And again, they have their own specific way of communicating. These guys make clicks, and that's kind of all they make. The distinctive sort of square head they have contains a really sophisticated sound-producing organ called the spermaceti organ, and it's dedicated to focusing sound. Most of the time they use it for echolocation. When they're socializing, they make these kind of patterns of clicks. And we call these patterns of clicks coders for sort of obscure historical reason, but it's stuck now. And a large part of my research career has been describing the different types of coders that sperm whales make in different types of the world, because this is an interesting feature of sperm whale coders. If you go to the Mediterranean, for example, you hear that sort of distinctive 3 and a 1 pattern in Dominica, in the Caribbean. A distinctive pattern that we call the sort of 2 clicks and then 3 rapid ones in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. You get these kind of regular ones, and down in the South Atlantic off Brazil and Uruguay, you get these rapid patterns. And I've never heard a sperm whale coda that's been recorded in Scottish waters, so I'm obviously fascinated, if we were to ever hear one, which of these dialects it would actually be from, and that could tell us, you know, which part of the world the sperm whale had travelled from in order to get to Scotland. Another interesting feature is that in many places you actually get groups with different dialects living in the same place. So in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, for example, we have these groups that make these regular patterns, and then we have these +1s. With a gap before the last click, and also groups that make a very distinctive short coda. So I've sort of gone off on one about sperm whales here because they're my particular personal enthusiasm, but again, we think that these patterns are part of the behavior that they learn from each other, right? So again, we think they learn their communication behavior from each other, and we also think they learn their movements from each other as well. And it is that information about movement that may cause them to end up or not end up visiting the Firth of Forth. Finally, one of the smallest cetaceans you'll see, but actually one of the most common ones are these guys, the harbour porpoises. This is a report of a harbour porpoise that made it up as far as Grangemouth. Appeared to be in not great shape by the time it made it up there, which is probably not surprising because it's starts to transition up there from marine to freshwater, and it's not natural porpoise habitat. They're really quite small, so they're difficult to see, so you need a calm day to be able to spot them. You know, again, there's thought to be a large number of these animals, 350,000 in the North Atlantic, of which you know, many are found around Scotland. So that's some of the diversity. I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, some of the major threats, as in direct hunting and the worst pollution from the industrial heritage of parts of the Firth of Forth may have declined, but there are still substantial threats to cetaceans in and around the Forth. So a really significant one is actually entanglement in fishing gear, whether it's pots or abandoned nets. This is a real threat, because if a whale gets caught in this kind of stuff, there's little it can do. So a few years ago, some of my students were involved in taking samples and autopsying this minke whale, which was the victim of entanglement and ended up on West Sands in St Andrews. And this is a problem that isn't just an issue for whales, it's actually an issue for humans as well. So some of you may have seen this story in the press recently about the trawler Charisma that lost power, having become entangled in I think what I believe was lobster gear just a few weeks ago, and then it ended up on the rocks. The vessels themselves can cause mortal injury if animals are struck by it only takes a small vessel to cause significant damage to small cetaceans like harbor porpoises, but larger animals like humpbacks and minkies, if they are hit by or struck by the propeller of larger ships, can really end up in a bad way. The issue of noise pollution is a really interesting one, and a current one that scientists are trying to understand, because it's very difficult to actually measure the impact of noise on cetaceans, but we strongly suspect that there are impacts. All of us will have our least favorite sounds, and all of us will at one point or other experience some kind of an acoustic annoyance or acoustic disturbance, and we know how discombobulating it can be. And the fact is that many cetaceans rely on sound, whether they're for echolocation or for finding each other, and that these processes are going to be affected on some level by noises that our activities generate. So just to give you an idea, one of the things that's going on in many places is pile driving for burying foundations for undersea structures, whether it's wind farms or anything else, and these sounds can travel an awful long way in the ocean. So this is a pile driving sound that's recorded just 500 meters from the activity. But you can actually, quite hear these quite clearly at ranges of up to 40 kilometers. So these sounds have the potential to affect things over a large area. And here's some estimates that have been put forward for this phenomenon called masking, where if you put a lot of noise into the ocean, it can reduce the distance over which these animals are able to communicate with each other, or to navigate, or to detect prey. And just give you a sense of scale, this is the North Atlantic, right? Florida and Nova Scotia and New York in the middle. And these are estimates of how changes in ambient noise over the last 100 years that we've been able to measure in the ocean may have reduced the communication ranges for blue whales from pre-industrial times. They may well have been able to hear each other over enormous areas in the North Atlantic, and it's possible that it's been reduced to just what you see on the right there in modern conditions. Now, it's notoriously difficult, as you can imagine, for the kind of scales that we're talking about here to get accurate information about these kind of effects. So it can be very difficult to predict. But here, for example, is data showing very clearly on a much smaller scale that harbor porpoises can be excluded from areas when really quite moderate source level 145 dB deterrent devices are used. I'm not aware of these being used in the Firth. They're typically used on things like salmon farms to deter seals from taking salmon, for example, but they can have exclusionary effects. And again, it's very difficult for as scientists to kind of interpret, well, what does this exclusion mean in terms of the life of that animal, right? If you can't go to a particular area, what does that mean? Do they have one less calf, 10 less calves? How much does it affect the population? And although, we've made great strides in improving our polluting behavior in the ocean, we're still living with the effects of it now. This is quite a sobering paper that was published by some of my colleagues, Ailsa Hall and Bernie McConnell, in the Sea Mammal Research Unit a couple of years ago, showing that PCB pollution is a real threat for killer whale populations around the world. And marine mammals particularly vulnerable to chemical pollution because they are such bioaccumulators and biomagnifiers. So killer whales will be harvesting accumulating from many different sources over their long lifetime and their substantial blubber storage. They'll be accumulating toxins and pollutants and concentrating them in their blubber, and then that gets metabolized when they have calves, and it gets passed on to their calves in their milk. So this is a potentially serious problem, and the UK population here is highlighted as one that has been particularly has particularly high PCB levels. So there are real concerns, and not a lot we can do about it other than obviously trying to stop putting these chemicals and these compounds into the water. Okay, in terms of activities in the Forth now, I'm sure you're aware there are these plans for offshore renewable energy installations that are now actually ongoing. You can see them being installed if you look out to sea from Anstruther and the Isle of May. And this is going to necessarily involve some increase in ship traffic and things like that. But the effects are quite hard to predict. And so I just wanted to finish with this, what I thought was a really interesting study that, again, colleagues of mine, Debbie Russell, Dave Thompson, Gordon Hastie, Vincent Yannick from the Sea Mammal Research Unit were involved in, looking at marine mammal behavior, in this case seals, around an operating offshore wind farm. This one was actually on Sheringham Shoal, just north of Norfolk in the North Sea. And SMRU is world renowned for, the Sea Mammal Research Unit is world renowned for making these devices on the seal's head here, these tags that are glued on and then report positions back. And what I'm going to show you here is a little animation of one animal that was instrumented in the wash here near to the wind farm. And you'll see that as I started playing, you see the animal actually using this area in the wind farm quite a lot, and then using it in quite a distinctive way, right? It goes between each of the windmill installations and then spends time at each one. So over time, you see that it actually traces out the structure of the wind farm because it is visiting each installation, each windmill in turn, and spending some time next to it. And we don't fully understand what is going on here, but it seems quite likely that it's related to foraging, and that actually the seabed structure that these wind farms are generating, and the exclusion therein of certain forms of fishing activity, especially trawling, is actually creating a kind of garden effect for the fish, and that these are sort of, in a way, acting as artificial reefs, generating diversity. Now, what remains to be seen is whether that's actually concentrating existing fish biomass and making it more vulnerable to seal predation, or whether it's actually elevating the levels of biomass overall. But you can rest assured that my colleagues and I are going to be studying these installations as they go in, and the effects that they may or may not have on cetaceans. And that's all I wanted to talk to you about. I've gone on for quite a while now. I hope to some extent I've met the brief that Ken gave me, and I'll stop sharing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Okay, thanks.